If the ability to shape the future of women is in our power, what kind of world do we want for them? A girl born today will live in an unequal society, where she is likely to face more economic, social, mental, and physical hardships than boys as she grows up. In school, she may be discouraged to take classes that are not for girls. She may be one of the 12 million girls each year who are married before she turns 18. She might only make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes for doing the same job. She might even be pressured to choose between having a career or having children. And laws might not fully protect her right to a safe and healthy work environment. She might be 1 in 4 women who will experience gender-based violence. In most cases, the perpetrator will not be a stranger, but a partner, a family member, a friend, or a neighbor. Asia hosts the largest number of women and girls killed by their intimate partner. What if we can change all of that? Imagine being born into a world where girls know they can achieve anything and they can shape their own dreams. A world where no one will stop her from getting an education because there are no limits to what she can achieve. She will be fairly compensated and will work among colleagues who respect her contributions. She will have a seat at the table, break glass ceilings, and open doors for other women to follow. She won't have to choose between a career and a family because she can have both if she wants, when she wants. She will live a life free from violence because that is her fundamental right. She will live in a world where she is valued without discrimination and bias. This alternative future is possible. The world has made progress on gender equality, yet it will still take 270 years to close the gender pay gap. 270 years is too long. Today, as we face a pandemic and a climate crisis, we have the opportunity to construct a different future for women and girls and shape the future for all of us and the planet. ADB is committed to accelerating gender equality in the Asia and Pacific region. We support and engage women so they may fully benefit from everything we do, to help girls realize that anything is possible, to support women to be able to enjoy decent work and break into fields where they have been excluded in the past, to support women's access to food, water, to everything our planet offers, and lead on climate change action, and to be agents of change in their communities. Because when women thrive, all of humanity thrives. We at ADB are working to transform women's lives. Will you join us?
Whoa, what a powerful video. And thank you for joining us here today. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our distinguished guests and colleagues joining us from around the world. My name is Susanne D. Petersen, and I'm the director of BPCT, and I'm delighted to be here opening today's event. So ADB has long been committed to gender equality and to recognizing International Women's Day as a moment to acknowledge and honor women around the world for the contribution we make each day to society. Today, we have the honor of welcoming the Honorable Sabra Ibrahim Noordeen, Special Envoy for Climate Change to the Maldives, and our distinguished keynote speaker. So her presentation will be followed by a moderated Q&A session led by Samantha Hong, who is the Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group in SDCC. But first, I would like to invite President Masa to deliver his opening remarks, followed by Vice President for Administration and Corporate Management, Bruce Gosper. The President Masa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Suzanne. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to ADB's annual celebration of International Women's Day. This year's theme is Women Leading Towards an Equal and Greener Future. As a climate bank for Asia and Pacific, ADB's support in this area is absolutely critical because women's knowledge, skills, and leaderships are some of the most significant resources we have to address the climate crisis. I am pleased to welcome an exceptional leader to share her experiences with us, the Honorable Sabra Ibrahim Noordeen, Special Envoy for Climate Change for Maldives. Before we hear from our distinguished guest, let me offer a few reflections on today's theme. My friends, in order to rebuild from the pandemic towards a greener, more inclusive and resilient future, we must place gender equality at the center of our efforts. The reason for this has been made clear in many parts of our region, including right here in the Philippines, where Super Typhoon Odette brought terrible destruction to islands in the southern region of the country last December. The typhoon affected over 9 million people and damaged 1.4 million homes. We see in places like this that hard-earned development gains can be reversed in a matter of days, and the frequency and intensity of these events will increase due to climate change. In the aftermath of these disasters, women face increased burdens of care as they travel long distances searching for water and face food insecurity. They are at increased risk of gender-based violence, harassment, and abuse. And with severe disruption to schools, health facilities, and services, women of reproductive age also risk losing access to urgent sexual and reproductive health care. I am proud of ADB's quick response to Typhoon Odette through a $2 million grant to help restore critical life-saving services and provide food assistance. In addition to immediate support like this, let me describe two important ways that we can place women's leadership at the heart of our work to address the challenges posed by disasters like Typhoon Odette. First, let us fully embrace the role of women as leaders and knowledge bearers for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Last year, I met many of these remarkable individuals at the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, including heads of national delegations and civil society. I encourage you to support their work and learn from their transformative ideas. Second, as many of you know, we aim for 75% of ADB's operations to promote gender equality by 2030, and it is also our ambition to provide $100 billion in cumulative climate finance also by 2030. I want you to incorporate gender-responsive climate and disaster risk finance towards these ends. Please keep in mind that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, so we must ensure the adequate resources reach them. Let me end by expressing my most profound confidence that our work together will deliver the gender transformative ideas and resources the region needs at this critical moment. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, President Masa, and also thank you so much for highlighting how we need a more inclusive future to ensure that the right skills, knowledge and leadership to combat the climate crisis. Encouraging messages on a day like today. So I would like to invite our next speaker, the Vice President Gasper, to introduce our keynote speaker. VP Gasper, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and hello everybody. It's my pleasure to be here with you to celebrate International Women's Day. As President Masa has just highlighted in his remarks, embracing women's skills, knowledge and leadership are critical components for overcoming climate change and for solidifying a successful future. The same is true for organizations such as our own. When women have equal opportunity, equal voice, and are represented in leadership, organizations thrive. Diverse and inclusive organizations are more innovative and better able to tackle the daunting challenges of our time, such as climate change. International Women's Day is a time to not only mark progress, but also time to reflect on how much more we need to do to achieve true gender equality. Late last year, we established a gender task force working closely with Suzanne and her team with the goal of diagnosing areas for how ADB can improve in how we recruit, develop and retain talented female staff. We are deeply committed to helping ADB achieve its gender goals, and I firmly believe our values support our need to be successful in this endeavour. It is now my distinct honour to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honourable Sabra Ibrahim Noordeen. Ms. Noordeen was appointed in 2021 to serve as the first envoy for climate change at the President's Office of the Maldives. She is responsible for leading the Maldives' interests in the international arena with regard to the climate change emergency. Ms. Noordeen previously served in the President as the Secretary for Foreign Relations and has worked in many capacities for the Maldivian Democratic Party, especially in the coordination of national election campaigns, foreign relations and communications. She has also worked at the British High Commission in Colombo and is a Director and Intelligence Analyst at the Maldives Police Service. She holds a master's degree in State, Society and Development from the University of London. Ms. Noordeen is a tireless advocate for her country and for bringing together stakeholders to address the climate crisis. She will share her experiences and perspectives on leading on climate change adaptation, mitigation and response, and the role that women and girls are playing as powerful leaders and effective change makers in this arena. We are indeed privileged to have Ms. Noordeen address us today. Everyone, please help me welcome the Honourable Sabra Ibrahim Noordeen to the ADB. Thank you.
Thank you. President of the Asian Development Bank, His Excellency Masatsugu Asakawa, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event today. I am immensely honored. Firstly, let me wish you all a very happy International Women's Day. In a world of uncertainties, there are some things we can be certain of, and this year's Women's Day theme encapsulates it perfectly. Gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. It is a certainty that closing the gap on gender equality leads to more sustainable outcomes. It is a certainty that to lead secure, healthy, dignified lives, we must shift to more sustainable and resilient paths of development. It is a certainty that we must urgently do both. In my address today, I have been asked to reflect a little on my own experiences. I come from the Maldives and fully acknowledge my privilege in belonging to a family who have always supported my wishes, personally and professionally. It is a privilege to have the financial means and the social solidarity to pursue my passions. And it is a direct advantage when facing systematic gender-based challenges. Systemic challenges include misogyny, sexual harassment in especially male-dominated workplaces, and cultural values that have been used to justify gendered roles. Resilience is a word I often use in my work, especially in relation to the Maldives' ability to withstand the worst impacts of the climate crisis. In this context, it can come across as an abstract, technical word associated with coastal protection and rising sea levels. But where I've learned the true meaning of resilience is through the women I have been fortunate to grow up with and work with. Women like my maternal grandmother, who married at a very young age, had 10 children, of whom 7 survived, worked hard to support her family and the wider community with home-based businesses amidst great political upheaval, and now perseveres through multiple mental health challenges. Or my mother, who had a thriving career in the Foreign Service, which she gave up to become the primary caregiver for a child with special needs, moving away from her immediate support networks to search the world for treatments that were not yet available in the Maldives. And now to my colleagues, young working mothers who perform the daily juggling act of leading and formulating climate policy in what is still a very patriarchal system, while attending international conferences, remote working, and figuring out how to wean our babies. My grandmother had a whole network of extended family members, strong matriarchs, in-laws, and cousins to help her navigate her life. I have all this plus a WhatsApp group, the Pregnancy Advisory Group. Resilience is the thread that runs through. Resilience is community, collaboration, advocates for progressive policies, and most importantly, support to be able to adapt to whatever comes our way. For this type of support to be universal and sustainable, there must be great structural change. Crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts of climate change expose and intensify the structural injustices inherent in our systems. Across the world, and especially in the global South, this impact is unfortunately felt most by women. In our part of the world, we face simultaneous challenges of ensuring access to basic services and fulfillment of developmental needs, while also ensuring these solutions are climate progressive and sustainable. We now know, and it has been highlighted extensively in the recent IPCC report on adaptation, that for an initiative or a community to be climate resilient or sustainable requires it to be gender inclusive. The Maldives has made great strides in achieving gender parity when it comes to education and the health sectors. And women do make up a significant part of the workforce, especially in the public sector. But there is a distinct gender gap in leadership and management levels. We're now working to ensure greater gender equality in decision-making, legislation, and policy formulation. Our gender equality plan attempts to rectify and reform some of these issues. When we discussed these issues at a recent internal meeting, someone commented that a lot of these reforms, such as gender quotas in various branches of the state, seemed very top-down. It's true, it is. That is, however, the nature of the beast. Without the active appointment of women into leadership roles or mandated quotas, progress for gender equality has been slow and stagnant. But times are changing. Today's generation in the Maldives demand more equality. They rightfully question the representative value of an all-male panel. They are vocal about the lack of support systems around to enable young families, and especially working mothers, to remain in the workplace. With greater migration into urban settings, constrained living spaces, and an inability to rely on traditional extended family networks, they demand systemic support such as flexible working, childcare facilities in workplaces, and more concerted action towards misogyny and sexual harassment. These conversations are important and necessary for us to change, and it has led to active policy shifts. For the first time in the history of the Maldives, we now have women justices in the Supreme Court and aim to increase the composition of women in the judiciary to 15% from its current 9%. We have introduced 6 months of paid maternity leave and 1 month paid paternity leave. I was lucky enough to be one of the first beneficiaries of this policy. In April 2021, the Maldives held local council elections under the amended Decentralization Act, which ensures that women make up 1/3 of the newly elected councils. 388 women councillors were elected last year, along with greater financial independence and an increase in budget for the councils and their women's development committees. The number of women now in leadership and policy roles, especially at a local government level, has certainly increased. We would also like to set targets for at least 30% of the candidates funded by political parties to be female, and to increase the participation of women in political party governance to at least 40%. The hope is that with more women around the table, there will be a more accurate reflection of the issues facing local communities, which is then translated to more practical, progressive, and sustainable policy. But the election alone isn't enough. There is a recognition that traditional, cultural, or social ideas about gender pervade so heavily that in certain circumstances, it has meant a limitation in the roles of these newly elected women councillors into very traditional gendered activities. A more concerted effort to raise awareness, increase the technical capacity of newly elected councillors, assistance with the formulation of work plans, and land use plans are being implemented to overcome these challenges. Rising emissions and the impact of global heating is not an abstract scenario, but one that is already directly and disproportionately impacts women. With an increase in the number of disasters that we have to respond to, floods, water contamination, storm surges, it is mostly women and their livelihoods that are most frequently affected. In the Maldives and in many other developing countries, women are at the center of home-based economic activities, small-scale agriculture, fish processing, and with every flood or climate crisis-related impact, such as ocean acidification or migration of fish stocks, it is these activities that get disrupted. What we have found difficult to do so far is the assessment of these economic losses. It is easier to value damage to hard infrastructure and furniture, but more challenging to value loss of crops and home-based economic activity, especially in a context where there is an unfamiliarity in providing the level of data needed for compensation schemes. Perhaps we need to change the way we formulate our questions, or be flexible in the ways we interact and engage with communities. Newly elected Women's Development Committee members' opinions on waste management, disaster risk reduction, and boosting economic activity is vital to building resilient communities. Some of the other policies we are implementing are to do with programs to create more awareness on disaster risk and reduction, which include assisting local communities to initiate basic emergency measures without waiting for the arrival of frontline responders, or tactics to increase the resilience of homes and properties against floods. The establishment of water and sanitation systems on all inhabited islands is a primary pledge of this administration, and one that we hope to complete by next year. Ensuring access to piped, safe water and proper sanitation systems is adaptation to climate change, and it also serves to decrease the burden on women in terms of health and hygiene for home-based economic activity and wider caregiving roles. Ongoing projects on expanding renewable energy in the Maldives include a comprehensive gender component, which calls for the active recruitment of women, especially in the outer islands, to more technical roles. As a result, our utility company, Fenica, have gone from having 1 woman in a technical role to 8 women in technical roles. The project aims to work closely with development committees to overcome certain traditional values about what jobs are suitable for women and the economic and social benefit of renewable energy to the islands. A lot of our progress in advancing gender equality depends on the greater visibility of women in these roles. Women are often portrayed as the backbone, the foundation of economies and communities, but that has also allowed an inaccurate valuation of their contributions, economically and socially. It is important to hear the stories of the people who are our support systems, who perform the greatest amount of unpaid care work. It is important to see gender equality amongst our leadership, legislature, and administrative branches. I'm proud to have been part of a delegation to COP26 that was female-led and included mostly women negotiators. I'm proud that our Minister for Environment, Climate Change and Technology, Minister Shauna, was appointed by the COP presidency as a co-chair to facilitate the negotiations on adaptation, and specifically the global goal on adaptation. The gender compositions at COPs have improved, but there's a lot more to do. In the Maldives, we want to be in a position where we can recruit more negotiators to our delegation and to specifically address gender equality and youth representation through these appointments. To do so, we need access to resources that allow us to train negotiators in the technicalities of climate discussions and support them to travel and participate in international climate conferences to build up their experience. Before I conclude, I'd like to touch on a weakness in our systems, the gender data gap. Not having access to timely data, and especially sex disaggregated data, is a significant disadvantage in policymaking. We have begun implementing some excellent policies in the Maldives: introduction of a minimum wage, commitment to net zero emissions by 2030, expansion of protected areas, increase in salaries for the education sector, a free first degree program, access to loans for higher education, to name a few. But we haven't been able to properly analyze the impact of these policies through a gender lens. For instance, the majority of graduates are women, but what are the challenges they face in securing employment or being appointed to managerial or leadership positions? Why aren't more women contesting for the parliament? The tourism sector is our predominant industry, but only 12% of resort workers are women. And of this, a very small minority is made up of Maldivian women. How can we work around cultural biases and offer structural solutions like greater flexibility and security to attract women into these roles? Are we counting the number of women in the support roles of the tourism industry? Aviation, marketing, food and beverage, water sports? We know that access to data that is gender inclusive allows the better honing of policies, stronger communication on wider benefits to women and society, and a shift in mindsets where gender must be mainstreamed into all social and political considerations. The need to value women's voices and incorporate gender considerations into our national and international programs is one that requires a constant and consistent effort. The Maldives is on the front lines of the climate crisis. There are certainties that we have to embrace. Without a drastic reduction of global carbon emissions to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, our lives and livelihoods face an existential crisis. We have to adapt to a heating planet, and we cannot do it without the full inclusion of the most resilient amongst us. Gender inclusivity, gender equality must not be a side note or an annual celebration, but something that is ingrained into everything we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabra, for your very, very thoughtful, thought-provoking and interesting remarks about your whole experience, your personal journey. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Also, some of the latest developments in your country, some of the significant progress that's been made. I think it was very relatable for everyone listening, both in terms of ADB operations, but also in terms of our own work as an institution, in terms of becoming a more gender friendly workplace, as VP Gosper was talking about. We're now moving on to a more interactive part of the program. But before that, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Samantha Hong, Chief of the Gender Equality Thematic Group, in case there's some people on the call that I haven't met. We do have a very active, very large group. We've got close to 760 people on the call. So I'd really encourage people to ask questions in the chat box if it's working, or in the Q&A, and we can definitely take some of those as we move along. But maybe just to start with, I will kick off with a couple of questions for you, Sabra. You talked a lot about the importance of having women at the table and the difference that that makes in terms of different perspectives. And as you well know, the UNFCCC under the Lima Program of Action is actually working to increase the number of delegates to COP negotiations. We have seen an increase over time. I mean, if we think about the first COP1, it was, I think, only about 12% women. So we've come a very long way. But still, you still use the term patriarchal system. And we do know that it's still very few that have reached close to 50%. And you are one of the few female envoys on climate change. So I'd be interested to hear your perspectives. You talked a little bit about this in your remarks, but maybe you can go a bit deeper to share with us what you think are some of the possible strategies for increasing this actual female representation in climate negotiations. And I guess more importantly, what difference does that make in having more women at the table? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the difference is, for me especially, the Maldives delegation, it has traditionally been led mostly by male colleagues and very experienced male colleagues in climate negotiations. But there is a very distinct difference in how we approach gender issues. And that was, I think, reflected very much at last year's COP, when I think or there might have been a sentiment that we don't necessarily need to address gender equality in the discussions of the climate crisis, whereas a lot of us would disagree in that we have to actively talk about gender inclusivity in the climate crisis in order for everything we do to be inclusive and resilient. It was last year's COP was, we were able to participate in a group photo of women leaders and women officials at COP. And it was a great experience to be surrounded by all these amazing women from all over the world who have been working so hard on advancing climate negotiations for so many years. I think the difficulty with COP is that you have to attend a lot of COPs in order to gain the experience to kind of contribute to that process. And that requires a lot of time and a lot of resources in order to be able to, first, I mean, especially coming from a small island state, to attend the COPs. And something that we are trying to do is to really actively recruit women and especially young people into our delegations. The difficulty we're having is really funding. For instance, you have when things are in person, you have multiple international conferences to attend, and to try and get people there and to accommodate them. That's where we're having our difficulties. But I'm very pleased that at COP last year, a lot of our negotiators, especially the women negotiators, weren't limited to just some of the more kind of gendered issues or the traditionally gendered issues. I mean, we covered the breadth of them: climate finance, Article 6, which is the most kind of technical of them all. And I think just even seeing the picture of the Maldivian delegation, which majority was young women, helped, because it shows that we need more women, and it's definitely doable.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, as you say, it's something that has to be sort of tackled at all levels, and it's not a level playing field to start with. I mean, even at a very practical level, how do you address some of those barriers? Then how do you mentor? How do you give the technical skills? So it's great that your government is making that effort, and we look forward to seeing higher numbers of female negotiators across the board on all countries looking forward. But maybe that's a good segue for, actually then what does it mean on the ground, and how do we actually address some of the really critical adaptation issues on the ground? You're very aware that the latest IPCC report released, I think last week, talked about the urgency and the urgency of the need for addressing inequalities and how they're being exacerbated, and the real need for transformative change. And really the gender piece is a really key part of that adaptation and requiring more investment. So next week, as you well know, the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women is being held, and this is the theme, talking about women's leadership in this space. What do you hope will come out of some of those discussions and recommendations that are going to be negotiated by those governments attending?
Well, we've actually been working on this with our gender ministry because they're preparing to travel to New York. And the thing I would like to see is, we see a lot of focus among international organizations, and ADB, the UN, on including gender components into all of your projects and all of your work. And it's not something that we do nationally at a mainstream level yet. And that's something that I would like to see more of. And that is a recommendation that we quite often get, that we have to have a kind of a gender component in everything we do. So that's something that I really hope gets pushed more. And on the issue of data especially, that's something that we just don't look at things through a gender lens when we should be. And that makes us miss out on a lot of questions and analysis on how our policies are faring, or not faring well. So those are the kind of things that that I'm hoping to see. And one of the benefits of these conferences is that it makes us question our practices at home and makes us amend them in a way that we haven't had to before. So when the ADB requires a project in the Maldives to have a gender component, it means that we have to focus on it. And that it also means that in the next project that we may do, we will include a gender component, because now we know that that's something that we should be doing. So those are the type types of kind of systematic gender inclusive policies that I'd like to see recommended through next week in New York.
Thank you for sharing those insights, and we of course also look forward to seeing what the agreed conclusions say, so we can also use them to inform our own work. And that's you talked about data, and there actually has been a question that's come through the audience, and they're asking that what do you see as the real challenges in collecting sex disaggregated data, and how do we actually address this at national level or subnational level?
Very basically, we just don't ask whether the person is, what gender the person is when we ask the question. On specific issues like disaster risk and reduction, what I've heard from our kind of disaster management agency is that it's very difficult. Traditionally, a lot of the involvement in the agricultural sector are women, and it's difficult for them to value the losses. So they might say, yes, this plot of this plantation plot was destroyed, but they won't know how to value to give the economic cost of that loss. And I think that might partly be because we've never had that conversation of how much investment is going into that plot in the first place, and therefore how much they're losing. So that's something that the Gender Ministry and also local councils and the National Disaster Management Agency are working on, to try and see how we can get around, is it a way of reframing the question of asking people, or to at least maintain a record of how much they've invested right from the beginning and how much they think they stand to lose. It's not as straightforward as infrastructure. And in terms of things like the minimum wage or even maternity leave and paternity leave, are we collecting information on whether greater, the implementation of the minimum wage or greater service charge in the tourism industry has led to more women actively wanting to enroll up in the tourism industry, or are more women actually staying in their jobs when earlier they wouldn't have? We don't actually monitor these things. I think those are issues that we should be monitoring.
Thank you very much, Sabra. Yes, I mean, the issue of data cuts at all levels. It can be really, I mean, as you said, just asking the right question, requiring disaggregated data and surveys. But then, as you were elaborating, it's when you dig deeper and actually then use the data to actually better understand the gender issues for more evidence-based policymaking. That's when you get an even more nuanced and gender responsive approach. But we've got to start somewhere. And I guess the very basic is making sure that we collect sex disaggregated data as much as possible. Please keep getting your questions coming in while we're doing that and waiting for a few more. I have a couple more that have come in, but you also talked about, I want to pick up on what you said earlier about personal agency and things that we can do and everyone can do. And I wanted to ask a little bit about the issue of plastic, because last week, heads of state and various other players from 175 nations, as you know, endorsed a resolution about plastic and hoping to work towards an international legally binding agreement by 2024. I mean, obviously, this is something that's very important to the Maldives because of your rich biodiversity, the reefs, and the impacts that plastic has, not just on diversity, but also on health, on tourism, livelihoods, etc. So can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I know that you think this is an important issue, but what is your vision about people's agency and what people can do at a personal level to tackle plastic waste now?
Firstly, I'm very happy with what happened in Kenya last week with the passing of, with the commitment on a global treaty. It gives us so much more support to our own domestic plastic policies and legislation. We've begun implementation of our single-use plastic phase-out plan. And actually, one of how it came about domestically was mainly through civil society and schools and students and children really taking up the issue of single-use plastic and raising it to such an extent that, you know, they would talk about it constantly at home with their parents. And then their parents would bring it up to their kind of policymakers. And eventually it turned into a policy, a national level policy. And I think there's a really great way of how we can formulate sustainable policy. And we really discussed how to address the issue of single-use plastic on an individual level and a community, like a systematic community level, that especially if you're not able to offer alternatives to single-use plastic, can you, it's going to be very difficult to ask people to give these up. And then we had certain policy issues, like especially in waste management, where the waste management company requires you to put your rubbish into a single-use plastic bag in order for them to take it away. So we have all these things that, didn't really align with reducing our usage of single-use plastic. We started off with a lot of community level engagement from schools, where schools would be single-use plastic free. And there's an NGO in the Maldives called Max, working with another NGO called Plastic Nungote, which basically means another way other than plastic. And they specifically went to households and spoke to women in these households and asked them to try using alternatives to single-use plastic bags, and actually distributed alternative bags to them, and spoke to corner shops and tried to set up these links between these households and nearby shops to see if they could to see how well communities responded to it. And there has been there has of course been criticism and of course been disgruntlement about it, but I think there's so much lobbying from it, especially from younger generations and people who are dependent on, which is technically all of us in the Maldives, on our rich biodiversity, that we're very serious about tackling the issue now on an individual level, but especially on a systematic level as well.
Thank you for those thoughts, Sabra, about practical things as well as a more systemic approach. We do have some really interesting questions here now in the chat that come through. I may not be able to get through them all, but this is a good one. You talked about working with the Gender Ministry ahead of CSW, and cross-ministerial dialogue is really important for climate policy, but not always happening. So how is your government approaching this cross-ministerial coordination in the climate policy space? And do you think more can be done?
Cross-ministerial dialogue in every issue, I think, is critical, and it's a weakness in a lot of our systems. Sometimes I don't think we work in silos a lot, and there has to be a very active kind of conscious effort to go and actually speak to the other ministry. And part of my role is to make to mainstream climate resilience across government. I want to try and work on identifying the gaps that we have across government, and to see what we can do to increase climate resilience. And I believe that that's not just a Ministry of Environment or a planning ministry issue. I think that's across government. It should be Ministry of Environment, it should be Ministry of Gender, it should be defense, it should be all of us. And I'm actively, to the annoyance of my colleagues probably, bringing it up at every event that I can. But it helps to have good relationships with your colleagues, but also just to really kind of make the first move and discuss these things with people who may not necessarily think that climate is an issue that applies to them.
Thank you. And I think what you've just explained is also really relevant to ADB. I mean, ADB being a climate bag, you know, climate is everyone's business, irrespective of what sector we might be working in. So I think that's really, we ourselves have to approach it in a much more holistic way and bring everyone on board to work collaboratively across this space. Okay, so we've got a few questions. People are always interested in our speakers' personal perspectives on things. So there's maybe I will combine a couple of these questions. So the first part of it is, you know, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. Interested in what motivates you in your work, who are your role models and what inspired you? And I guess another question that relates to this, and it may be somewhat hypothetical because I don't know if you have a daughter or not, but the question is, how would a parent empower their daughter or perhaps or son to become a future leader for sustainable development?
Well, my role models, I have, as I mentioned, I have been very fortunate to grow up with and work with some very, you know, exceptional women and men, because honestly, they haven't tried to dissuade me from doing something that I'm interested in. And but you know, my grandmothers, my maternal and paternal grandmothers, they've been, I think, my biggest inspiration, in that they've always managed to adapt to whatever kind of hardship that they faced and still, you know, encourage their children and their grandchildren to do what they've been interested in. You know, my grandmother will still say, oh, you know, why are you traveling here? Why are you leaving your son there? But she will never stop me from doing something that I feel is important. I have a son and another one on the way, and I think it's just as important to bring up, or even more important to bring up, boys or men that are, you know, supportive of gender equality and as we do for our daughters. I'm trying to, and I've asked my family to as well, help me teach my sons to be as respectful and kind and supportive of women as they have taught me and my cousins and others to do so as well. In terms of, you know, other role models, I've been very fortunate in my work to meet, I mean, in terms before government, when we were actively trying to get into government, one of my biggest inspirations would be Amal Clooney, who we worked very closely with on a legislative case related to former President Nasheed. And I think she's exceptional and a very big inspiration to me. And my colleagues who I work very closely with are the Minister of Environment, Minister Shauna, and the State Minister, Khadija Nasim, and my immediate kind of colleagues in my office, Ulfat and Sarah, who are very inspirational young women who are never afraid to kind of propose their own initiatives or, you know, go after what they think is right.
Thank you for sharing those very personal perspectives. I fully agree with you that it's, you know, sons and daughters and raising them all to promote a more gender equal world is just as important. I have both, and I try very hard to raise them all as feminists, and I hope that they will become so. But you know, thanks for very much also for sharing your perspectives on your parents and grandparents and your colleagues. We also have been dealing with Sarah, and we also agree with you that she's been great. So maybe just time for one or two more questions, and this is an interesting one as well. You talked about the patriarchal system, and that's embedded in cultural norms across the region, obviously to varying degrees. What would you say about institutions that are struggling with addressing them, particularly at the top? How do we make these institutions accountable?
one of the things, well, actually, I like to use Women's Day as an example, because Women's Day is celebrated in so many different ways. But in the Maldives, there has been a tendency to use it as a day to kind of give flowers and chocolates and, you know, really shower women in the office with gifts. And the gender ministry yesterday released a circular asking everybody, you know, not to necessarily do these things, because that's not, you know, and to address the themes of International Women's Day. And there was a lot of backlash from people about, oh, you know, you shouldn't tell us how we should celebrate women, etc. And I think the point, you know, the ministry was trying to make was that it is possible to do both. You can celebrate women with flowers or chocolates or whatever, but also, you know, address the fact that you don't get flowers and chocolates every day, or even equal pay, or the, you know, or gender equality on every other day. And it is important to address the systematic issues as well as doing the kind of tokenistic gestures. On a management level, I think we really need to address issues like sexual harassment and misogyny and flexible working and things like HR practices on a more kind of on a more concerted level, because it's not something we've seen it done during the pandemic. For instance, flexible working and remote working were essential. It just happened. We had to do it. But that it means that we've shown we can do it. So we should be continuing those practices post-pandemic in the situations that we need to. For example, to try and retain more people who need those flexible working arrangements. Sexual harassment allegations, I think there's a lot more we can do to try and take them more seriously and address them in a way that is just, rather than trying to, you know, kind of hide the issue. And that, for me, honestly, that requires a lot of advocacy and talking to people in management levels and pushing for these policy changes, because it's not always that they don't want to do it. It's sometimes that they're just not aware that these things can be done in this way. And in some of our cultures, I think it's you just have to keep pushing.
Thank you, Sabra. So we've got probably time for just one last question. And I've got an interesting one from actually our Director General of our Southeast Asia Regional Department, Ramesh. And his question is about any thoughts you have on how do we start addressing gender awareness early through the education system, such as through primary schools. And if I could just add to that, also, how do we get more women into STEM education to address these issues at the high level? So if you could please maybe just answer both of those. Thank you.
I'm really glad this question was asked, because I've just seen a friend post a screenshot of a textbook in a primary school about just a very kind of gendered example that a child, you know, reads in one of their textbooks about a family with a mother taking on a very kind of domestic role and a father taking on a more kind of active sports related role. And I agree. I mean, I think we need to really go through our textbooks with that gender lens and you know, analyze it. Is this really the message that we want to be giving? Things like activities in schools, you know, the assumption that, for example, football is only for boys and not for girls, and that there's only a certain, you know, group of people that can take part in certain activities, is not something that I think we should be teaching children in primary school, because children are so powerful that they're able to affect change with what they bring home, and also with what they take back from home into schools. And I really think that gender awareness early in the education system is key. And in terms of STEM, we have a really great NGO in the Maldives called Women in Tech. And they've been doing really amazing work on trying to recruit more women into STEM, especially in the kind of regions outside of Mali, you know, trying to setting up coding camps and demonstrating that it is possible to be, you know, in these STEM technical roles and have a family and, you know, do all the other things that traditionally we've been expected to do. And I think that kind of awareness, and also our Minister for Environment, Climate Change and Technology is a woman. And I think she's really leading very well on these issues. So.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time for more questions. You know, or something good always has to come to an end, but I want to thank you so much for your inspiring time, especially getting up so early. I know you're traveling and you're really busy. And thank you for sharing your time with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my Director General, Bruno Carrasco, who's the Director General of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, where both gender and climate sit in the bank. Over to you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Sam. Good afternoon and happy International Women's Day. Sabra has so eloquently discussed the reasons why now is the time to act on climate change, not only to ensure a future for the people of the Maldives, but for all of us. I've had the pleasure of having worked on the Maldives during the period 2006 to 2014. Everyone who has worked in the Maldives knows full well that although a small country, it definitely punches above its weight, including in regional and international fora. I still vividly remember the picture that went viral in 2009 when President Nasheed so visually convened an underwater cabinet meeting to send a powerful message about the threat of global warming on the island nation. I watched the video again yesterday and was very pleased to see women cabinet members participating. Today's development challenges can no longer be addressed by the traditional siloed-based approach of yesteryears, and we need to be smarter by integrating sectors and themes as part of our development solutions. Sabra has eloquently spoken about this, including on promoting greater interministerial dialogue. Indeed, in today's event, we have seen the potential impact of integrating cross-thematic work. It is a fact that the gender-differentiated impacts of climate change do contribute to women's increased vulnerability, in many cases because of existing gender inequalities. As we have heard, these are caused by unequal power relations and structures, discriminatory laws and customs, and unequal access to control of resources. Yet these are all causes that we at an individual, community, and institutional level have the power to challenge and to transform. Research shows that when women are included in decision-making on resource use and societal investment, women more often than men make decisions based on the best interests of children, family, and community. Climate action is more effective when women and men participate and contribute to climate decision-making, policy formulation, and of course, implementation. Through our work and commitment to gender mainstreaming at ADB, we are striving to remove barriers to women's participation and to empower women to simultaneously improve climate and gender equality outcomes. ADB supports women's resilience to climate change at the community level through adaptation and mitigation projects. We will expand this work through a new program that will support grassroots women's groups and women-targeted interventions. The Community Resilience Partnership Program, launched last year at COP26, will support developing member countries to identify and prioritize investments to make households, communities, and small businesses more resilient to impacts of climate change, including through a dedicated window for women's focused investments. Our work on just transition also clearly identifies the central role of working on gender equality. Investing in a future workforce where women benefit from jobs generated by the green economy will result in a more just transition and inclusive, green, and resilient future for the region. President Masa and Sabra have highlighted that women's knowledge, skills, and leadership are a significant resource to build a resilient and green future for our region. I fully agree. By choosing to invest in women, ensuring that they have a seat at the table, hopefully above and not underwater, and allocating climate finance to gender mainstream projects, we go a long way towards adapting a changing climate and meeting our Paris commitments and Sustainable Development Goal targets. I want to thank once again Sabra for bringing to ADB your inspiring, valuable insights and personal experience as one of your country's leaders on climate change. The Maldives is not only at the front lines in terms of vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. You've seen at the front lines of bringing greater attention and a sense of urgency to the international community to address the climate crisis. To close, we will share a video put together by our BPMSD colleagues to invite all of us to join the global Break the Bias campaign. Thank you so much to everyone who participated and showed your commitment to rejecting discrimination, smashing inequality, and breaking biases. Thank you so much.
Bianca, are we wrapping up?